So we're going to finish off Jacob today, and we could go another 6 months on Jacob if we really wanted to. But today we're going to get him through because as we talk about the silence in the Old Testament, which people always fill because they're uncomfortable with the silence. And Jacob is trying to figure out who God is. His mom and his dad have always talked about God. His grandpa always talked about God. But as I'll point out, it's obvious that Jacob does not have a personal relationship with God, at least at this point. Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Remember, this is where Laban chases him down and says, "These are my grandchildren. This is my stuff. You stole it all." And Jacob says, "No." And all of a sudden, Laban has a dream where God comes to him and says, "If you harm him, you're done." And so Laban says, "But you know what? I'm willing to strike a deal." And so they swear. And Laban swears by all of his family gods. And it simply says, Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain, invited his relatives to eat a meal. They ate the meal, spent the night on the mountain. Laban got up early in the morning, kissed his grandchildren and daughters and blessed them, and then Laban left to return home. Jacob does not swear by the God of Nahor or Terah. Those are the gods that they worshiped, that are talked about across the river. He swears by the God whom his father fears and worships, the one who came to him in a dream. But he's still not sure yet what this means. Chapter 32, Jacob went up on his way and God's angels met him. When he saw them, Jacob said, "This is God's camp." And so he called that place Mahanaim. Now again, Jacob sees angels, believes obviously this is where God lives, or at least maybe this is where God vacations in the summertime. And he sets up an altar. So I got a question to ask. Have you ever thought about all the holy places that you can visit? What makes them holy? Is there a right place to build a church or a wrong place? Can the church be anywhere? Right now, there's a lot of Catholics that are going to visit one of the newest saints, and it's just this ordinary kid, and he's in a glass coffin, and they're going to make a pilgrimage there. There are individuals who make a pilgrimage to Mecca, those who go to Jerusalem. There are places that people go because they believe that they have some sort of holy event associated with them. Right down here, by the way, just straight down by the post office, there's 2 royal palm trees. Those palm trees mark where one of the ponds was that one of the kings left. The fish ponds that are out in Pearl Harbor, again, those were very special. They were set apart. When we think about this, what makes a place holy? First time that I did a change of command over at Pearl Harbor, I was in awe. We were at the submarine memorial, and we were there and all set up, facing out everything. And I was like, okay, I'm not military. How do I do this? A couple of chaplains walked me through it. I was all set. Then about a year later, I was asked to do a retirement ceremony. I said I'd be happy to. And I worked it all up anyway, and I wore my white robes and my white stole because they told me to go ahead and do that. I said, okay. And we got over there, and they said, meet at the Admiral's boathouse. And I said, well, that's kind of strange, but sure, okay. And we got over there, and Admiral Fargo was there, and the individual, by the way, who was retiring hadn't shown up yet. And he said, I'm so glad you're here. Just so you know, and we had a little talk because he almost put his kids in our school. He happened to be Episcopal and went up to St. Timothy, he and his wife. And we were chatting, and then Dave showed up. He was the one who was retiring. And the Admiral goes, all right. And he called, and they said, the boat's ready, sir. And we were getting in the boat, and I turned to Captain Dave, and I said, where are we going? He says, I told you, we're doing my retirement ceremony on the Arizona. I said, yeah. We're doing it over by the thing. He says, no, we're actually doing your retirement ceremony on the Arizona Memorial. And all of a sudden, everything that I had written, by the way, in my mind was not going to work. So we get out there, and I'm scribbling furiously, and my wife turns, she says, what are you doing? I said, my words are incomplete given the place that we are at. I said, I need to rewrite them, which I did. And there are certain places that command that awe and that respect. But here, Jacob's running around, and every time he sees something or has an experience, he starts stacking rocks up and pouring oil over them and saying, this is holy. So then we start asking, is this an okay place to have a church? Was there a correct corner for us to put the church on back in 1963? Is there a good place for a church or a bad place for a church? And I'm not talking about parking. I'm not talking about access to the freeway. I'm not talking about plenty of entrances and exits. I'm asking, are there places that are better for churches because the ground is holier? Verses 3-5, Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He commanded them, you are to say to my lord Esau, this is what your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have been delayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves. I have sent this message to inform you, my lord, in order to seek your favor. Now, here's what Luther said. Luther said, the form of greeting is in accordance with the Hebrew idiom and custom by which a person calls himself the servant of another superior person in order to declare one's respect. The greetings of the Italians are also of this kind, very polite. But the words of Jacob's greeting are not the words of a man who is afraid, but words of respect and courtesy. The mention of slaves and animal may be the offer of a bribe, could be just bragging, or could just be letting his brother know that he has done well. We don't know. See, here's one of the things. It's possible that if we lived 3,000 years ago, that this story, by the way, would have been told to us by our grandparents and great-grandparents, and they would have embellished it by saying, this is what we know, because not all of it was written down, but there were parts that were left out, but here we want you to know this, this, and this. But we really don't know. We do know that Jacob was doing what everybody was supposed to do. He knows that his brother had threatened to kill him because he had stolen the birthright and the blessing. And so he's coming home and he says, I'm coming home. Just so you know, I've been staying with Uncle Laban. I have done very well. I have all this stuff. And I am telling you because I'm asking for your favor. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, oh, we went to your brother Esau. He's coming to meet you, and he has 400 men with him. Now, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people with him into two camps, along with the flocks, cattle, and camels. He thought if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, the remaining one can escape. So Jacob went from, because remember, God told him in the dream a little while ago, he said, look, you're going to be fine. I'm going to stay with you until I've accomplished all that I've promised you. But now all of a sudden, Jacob is afraid. Jacob's attitude goes from being confident and joyful to concerned. He starts to practice self-preservation. Now, did he forget God's promise? Did he decide not to trust God? Because remember, if you remember, after God does all this promise, Jacob then says, if you do these things, God, then I will worship you and I will give you a tenth of everything I have. So, whereas God's covenant, a berith, is one-sided, I'm going to do this for you, Jacob turns it into a covenant, two-sided, where he turns it around and says, so God, if you do this, then I'll do this. Which of course means if God doesn't do that, then Jacob's not going to do this. And now all of a sudden that he hears his brother is coming with 400 men, and obviously he does not have 400 skilled soldiers in this crowd that he's got. And he starts to wonder what's going to happen. Verse 9, then Jacob said, God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, go back to your land and to your family, and I will cause you to prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Indeed, I have crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two camps. Please rescue me from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. Otherwise, he may come and attack me, the mothers and their children. So Jacob divides into two camps. Now he decides he needs to go and pray. So the first thing he does is very logical. I need to protect and make sure that I don't lose everything I have. Notice the lack of a personal relationship. You are my father's God. But this isn't unusual. This is why I always ask people, why are you a Lutheran? Why are you a Catholic? Why are you a Baptist? Now, up until 50 years ago, everyone said the same thing. Well, I'm Lutheran because my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., all the way back to Germany were Lutheran. I'm Baptist because my parents, grandparents, etc., were always Baptist. However, in the last 20 or 30 years, there was a huge exodus from the church where people suddenly said, yeah, I was born and raised Lutheran, but there's a church closer, or my friend invited me to a church, or, I found a church, by the way, that is more suited to who I am, or a place where I can make better business connections. And so I am this, but I'm not necessarily holding to that. It's just because this right now suits my needs. But nevertheless, all of us have a reason for the place that we choose to call home. And so if we were honest, we would turn and say something like, you are the God of my neighbor who invited me to church. You are the God of my boss who suggested I come to his church. You are the God of my parents and grandparents. You are the God of the person who put up the bulletin board that invited me to church. In other words, we are where we are at. So last Wednesday, I was attending church at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Concordia, Missouri, where my daughter and son-in-law and grandkids go to church. And there are people in that church who can trace their lineage all the way back to the founding of the church in the 1800s. They have never left the community. They've never left the church. And so literally, when they show up, they look at all the pictures and they can say, well, there's my great-great-great-grandpa. And when you walk around, there's various things that are named after people, and sometimes they'll say, oh, yeah, that's my, okay? That's what Concordia, Missouri is like. Here, I buried the last of our founding members quite a while ago. There's only 3 people left from when I arrived in 1990, because we are a fluid community. People come here for various reasons. And sometimes I get to know what those reasons are. In other words, oh, my friend told me about you, or I saw you online, or things are a little different. But when Jacob says, you are the God of my father, it doesn't mean that he doesn't believe. It just means that he's still trying to figure out who he is and what he is. Verse 12, you said, I will cause you to prosper, and I will make your offspring like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. There is nothing wrong with repeating back to God a promise that he made to you. Jeremiah 29:11. I know what I have in store for you, God says. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Isaiah 43, posted on the wall. I've called you by name. It never hurts to repeat this. This is not a question of God. It is simply saying, this is what I understand. Because sometimes we need clarity. Sometimes we have misinterpreted intentionally or unintentionally. Because notice what he says. You said if I moved here, that I would be blessed. You said my children would just begin to multiply like crazy. See, he didn't bother to ask, what is the cost of this? And so that's what he's asking now. Okay, God, you say I'm going to prosper. You say my children are going to multiply. But what is the cost involved in this? And when we ask God, because oftentimes we get excited about what we think the results are going to be, now we get to the point where we back up and we say, what happens now? What do I have to pay? What do I have to go through in order to get this? You've already said this is going to take place. How do we get it? Verse 13. Jacob spent the night there and took part of what he had brought with him as a gift for his brother Esau. 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 20 ewes, 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their young, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. Now, praying is important, but God also expects us to step forward in faith and actually think, then act according to our thoughts. In other words, when God says, you have been saved by grace through faith, this is not your work, it's the gift of God. That does not mean that we just sit in our homes, never going to church, never doing everything, never praying, never reading the Bible because we're saved. That's why the book of James got written. Faith without works is dead. You were saved for a purpose. Now that you're saved, here we go. And so this is why all of this becomes so important. So when Jacob says, all right, God, I poured out my prayers to you. Now I've already divided the camp up. Now I'm going to take animals from both groups and I'm going to put them into an offering basket so that when my brother arrives, I'm able to say, here you go. Okay? Now, by the way, this is standard operating procedure in the Middle East, not only at that time, but even today. Verse 16, he entrusted them to his slaves as separate herds and said to them, go on ahead of me and leave some distance between the herds. So he even takes all those that he has set apart, divides them up into two groups. And he told the first one, when my brother Esau meets you and asks, who do you belong to? Where are you going? And whose animals are these ahead of you? Tell him they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau. And look, he is behind us. So he sends them out in the first group. He wants them about a mile in between. So he sends the first group out. He says, when you run into Esau, say, these are from Jacob. They're a gift to you. And Jacob is that far behind us. Okay? Then, faith and bribes. The importance of self-preservation is strong with Jacob. Always has been. He sends the servants ahead as a peace offering, but also knowing that Esau may just take everything and still come after him. See, remember the whole I will kill you speech? So if Esau slaughters the first group or slaughters the second group, Esau will see it and he can run away. And so he's waiting to find out how this is going to play out. Verse 19, then he told the second one, the third, and everyone who was walking behind the animals, say the same thing to Esau when you find him. You are also to say, look, your servant Jacob is right behind us, for he thought, I want to appease Esau with the gift that is going ahead of me. After that, I can face him. And then these are very important words, and perhaps he can forgive me. Now, all of a sudden, by the way, it's no longer a bribe. It's restitution. And there's a big difference between the two. You see, basically what's happening is Jacob is growing up. He has recognized that what he did was wrong. He stole from Esau something that he should not have taken. He not only tricked Esau, but then he also tricked his own father into getting what he thought he deserved, even though by all rights and rules, those things were not his. He took something away from Esau that Esau can never get back. So now all of a sudden, for the first time, he is repenting of what he did. And he says, I'm going to set this aside as a guilt offering. And I'm going to make sure. Then verse 21, so the gift was sent on ahead of him while he remained in the camp that night. During the night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female slaves, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, along with all his possessions. Now, what we're going to see is Luther says, Moses, because remember, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses says he sent them across. It sounds as if he first led his household to the stream, crossed over by himself, tested in what water would be easily crossed, and later led his wives and children across. After he had crossed, he separated himself in a lonely spot and prayed with great anxiety because he was still full of terror and weakness. He chose a lonely spot because solitude is very well suited to those who are praying. For when prayer is serious and ardent, we do not readily allow those words to be heard, which we pour out before God in a rather inept manner. So Luther says it sounds like he went, tested it himself, found a shallow place, led his children, his wife, and his servants across, all the animals, got them all over there, set up the camp, and then said, I need to go spend some alone time. And he does. He says, I need to go, and I need to go through this on my own. Verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket, and they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. All right, so who or what is Jacob wrestling with? Is this an allegory, a metaphor, or is it an actual wrestling match? See, it's one of those things that there have been nights when I was wrestling with my conscience, or wrestling with something I knew was going to take place, or wrestling with something that had already taken place. And when I woke up in the morning, the bed was a mess. All of the comforter, the sheets, everything was just twisted in a pile because it was nothing but tossing and turning all night. And it could be said, I was wrestling in my sleep. Or was this just a metaphor, an allegory? He went apart and he was going, oh, what should I do? Now, we hold it's an actual wrestling match. The Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord, taking on human form to wrestle with Jacob. Now, the dawn is about a new day, the time to quit wrestling and walk in faith. God is not afraid of the day. If God has taken on human form and is wrestling with Jacob, it's not that he's worried about, oh, the sun is going to come up and he will see me for who I really am. God is about to tell him who he is. He's going to reveal it, so this is not the problem. But he says there is a time to end the wrestling match. This is one of those moments. This is the moment when we must make decisions. And as much as we would like to spend forever debating it in our head, we have to say it. There was a chaplain aboard a military ship working with the Navy, and President Harry S. Truman had to make a decision. He had to decide whether or not to drop the atomic bomb. He called the chaplain in. Chaplain's wife, by the way, just lived up here in Foster Village. Husband had died many years before that. And Chaplain Putler went up and interviewed her and talked with her. But this is one of those things that we gather all the information we can, but we have to set a deadline. Because as Captain James T. Kirk said, I can be right or I can be wrong, but I have to make a decision. As much as we would love to, even not making a decision is making a decision. And so the angel says, it's time. Ephesians 6. Be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the tactics of the devil. For our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world powers, this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. This is why you must take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having prepared everything to take your stand. This is always one of my favorite passages. Because when Jacob is wrestling, he's not wrestling with God. We'll talk about that in a second. He's wrestling with himself, his doubts, his fears, and the decision that he has to make. Verse 27. What's your name? The man asked. Jacob, he replied. Your name is no longer going to be Jacob. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. Now, the wrestler reveals himself when he says that Jacob has fought with God and men, and from the fight, he gives him a new name. The Hebrew word Yisrael means God contends, or one who struggles with God. Now, I want you to think about this. All the times that people had to wrestle with God. Jesus, 40 days in the wilderness, as he figures out what this means to be the Savior of the world. 40 days and 40 years in the wilderness for Israel with Moses. Holy fast. When somebody is taking a fast seriously, not just as part of a dietary thing, but an actual fast, because they are trying to cleanse themselves so that they can think clearly. This is where we're wrestling with God. Okay, God, I am going to set apart all of my things. I'm going to put my phone, I'm going to turn it all the way off. I'm not going to have any music, nothing. It's just me and you in the prayer closet. So what are these things about? Why does the church talk about them and use them? And the answer is because sometimes there are so many voices, either in our head or in the world, we can no longer hear ourselves think or pray. And we no longer can hear the voice of God. And sometimes we just need to step apart. Now, this doesn't mean that God won't speak through someone or speak through something. But there are times when we set ourselves apart and say, I am going to do a 72-hour fast, or 72 hours of being alone, or 72 hours of no phone or whatever. We're setting it apart, and basically we're saying, God, this is 72 hours where I want to hear clearly what you have to say. And this is important. Jacob didn't beat God in a wrestling match. It was never about a winner and a loser. It was always about holding on to God, pushing him, and allowing God to push you. I want you to think about St. Paul back when he was Saul, and he's blinded. And now he has to become completely dependent, not only upon God, but upon someone who will feed him and clothe him and take him where he needs to go. St. Peter's lostness. Jesus is dead. I told him I would die with him. Then I denied him 3 times. And they're out fishing because that's what you do. You go and you do something you don't have to think about, something you know really well. And then he sees Jesus. Jesus in the garden. Father, if there is any other way, but not my will, but yours be done. Moses in exile after he's killed the Egyptian. And all of a sudden he's got to figure out who he is. The Babylonian exile, while the people of God are scattered. All of the best and the brightest are taken away, and those who, were too old, or too feeble, or not smart enough were left behind. And they have to figure out who they are in this whole thing. Jacob then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, he said, and I have been delivered. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. That is why to this day the Israelites don't eat the thigh muscle, that is the hip socket, because he struck Jacob's hip socket as the thigh muscle. By the way, I want you to notice verse 31, the sun shone on him as he passed by this. I think that's something that we look at, and I don't want to make too big of a deal out of it, but I think it's important that the sun who he was wrestling with shines on him. Jacob has been humbled by his limp, but he doesn't seem to mind, which is pretty amazing because Jacob was about as vain as you could possibly get. He's finally coming to see God as more than just a vending machine. Okay, God, you said I was going to be blessed. You said I was going to have lots of kids. You said I was going to be wealthy. The prohibition against eating the sinew of the thigh, by the way, is a binding law within Jewish culture. Most Orthodox Jewish communities refrain from eating any part of the hindquarters where the inner and outer sinews are located because it is labor-intensive to remove the forbidden part. But, here's one of those things. This is where I ask the question, why are laws important? See, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, which is actually most important? Because nowhere does it say, nowhere does God say, all right, from now on, you are not allowed to eat the thigh meat. It's not what happens here. But the Jews have made it a very important part of their faith. Now, this is different than you should not eat catfish or lobster or pork. That was dietary in nature. Catfish and lobsters and crabs, things like that, are bottom feeders. And you know what floats to the bottom, things, and so they tend to take into themselves things that aren't that great. Pork, it may be the other white meat, but too much bacon does not do you well. So when they say, we're not going to eat thigh meat, this is something that serves to remind them of a point that's very important in their history. And it's one of those things when you go various places and somebody says, oh, we never do this, or we always do that. And you say, why? Because it's not part of your culture, not the way that you were raised or grew up. And then they say, oh, we need to tell you the story. So we were in Alaska. We had taken the VBX crew in. We were sitting there one day, gathered around. We were eating our MREs because we had taken up a couple of cases of MREs, and that was our food. And all of a sudden, there's a knock at the door, and one of the villagers is standing there, and he has a salmon in his hand that is still slightly moving. And he says, the chief asked me to bring this to you. And he handed it to us, and then he took off. We put it in the fridge. And then we had to go ask, why? The chief of the village wanted to honor us because we had come to take care of his grandchildren among the other children in the village. He wanted to honor us. He says, the first salmon that is caught, no matter by who in the entire village, is brought to the chief. He had his salmon. Then he requested the second one be brought to us to honor us. Now, when he explained why this was taking place, and it goes back into a whole culture, because first the chief gets it. Then after that, they take care of the widows. Then after that, then everybody can take care of themselves. And it was simply set up as a way that the village made sure. Once we understood the story, it was like, oh, this makes a lot more sense than where we're at and what we have gone through in our culture. Verse 33, or chapter 33. Now Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming toward him with 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female slaves. He put the female slaves and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. He himself went on ahead and bowed to the ground 7 times until he approached his brother. Does anyone notice anything about how he has arranged the family? Jacob is a new person. He divides up the family in order of his preference. That's still his old way. And their station in life, Rachel being the most loved. But then he leads them, walking ahead of them. This is very different than just yesterday. Jacob is now leading them. He is the first. If anybody's going to get killed, it's him. By bowing down 7 times, Jacob is asking for forgiveness. His prostrations are the equivalent of a puppy rolling over and exposing its throat to a bigger dog. When the puppy rolls over and does this, it's saying, I am completely and totally at your mercy. I'm not a threat to you. Jacob bowing down 7 times. I am not a threat to you. I have come to ask your forgiveness. But Esau ran to meet him, hugged him, threw his arms around him, and kissed him, and then they wept. When Esau looked up and saw the women and children, he asked, who are these with you? And he answered, the children God has graciously given your servant. Then the female slaves and their children approached him and bowed down. Leah and her children also approached and bowed down. And then Joseph and Rachel approached and bowed down. Time does not heal all wounds, but it does provide perspective. The tears are genuine. In the silence and the darkness, both brothers had had a chance to think, remember, and confess. Now, what helps is they are both very wealthy. This is not a matter of what you have, because I don't have anything and you have everything, therefore you took from me. It's, instead, both have all that they need and more, which allows them to see things a little differently. Because the whole purpose, and by the way, even though Jacob received the blessing and the right of the firstborn. Right now, who's running the family ranch? Esau. So Esau said, what do you mean by this whole procession I meant? To find favor with you, my lord. I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have. But Jacob said, no, please. If I have found favor with you, take this gift from my hand. For indeed, I have seen your face, and it is like seeing God's face since you have accepted me. Please take my present that was brought to you, because God has been gracious to me, and I have everything I need. And so Jacob urged him until he finally accepted. A debt is a debt. Remember when Isaac told the king, I will not accept anything from you so that you will not be able to tell people that you made me wealthy? Jacob is beginning to understand it isn't stuff that makes you wealthy. What matters here is something far more important. And he promised, and it's interesting. He said, God, if you make me wealthy, I'll give you a tenth. What he's giving to Esau is more than a tenth. But what he's saying is, I took from you that which was not mine to take. So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir, but Jacob went on to Succoth. He built a house for himself and stalls for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. Now after Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at Shechem in the land of Canaan and camped in front of the city. He purchased a section of the field where he had pitched his tent from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 keseth. Now, I skipped the part where Esau says, brother, come home with me. And Jacob says, I will come home with you. And he says, but you go first. My children and my wives and my animals are tired. And Esau says, well, then let me leave some people behind to protect you. And Jacob says, no, I'm just, and they go back and forth trying to outdo each other. And then finally, Esau says, fine, I'll go home, but you come and live with me. And Jacob says, I will. And instead, he stops and goes in a different path and he settles. And notice what it says. He built a house and stalls, put fence around it. And now he buys it. Now here's the thing. So why didn't Jacob go on where his brother lived? Okay? He said he was going to follow. Now, we're going to answer that question in a little bit. Why didn't Esau come get him? Again, we're going to answer that in just a second. Was it simply enough that the two had been reconciled, that any promises made were not meant to be serious? Or did both get caught back up into their life? This is one of those things. When you're back with somebody and you haven't been with them for a while, and you say, we got to get together often. Man, we've got to make sure that we see each other. Man, this has just been too long. And then the moment you get back into your life, you completely forget about it. It's not that you don't want to get together. It's just the whole reason you didn't get together in the first time was because life gets in the way. So we start to look at this and it's like, promises made, promises broken, or. Now, Jacob paid 100 pieces of money for that portion of land. And from that, it appears it was not a very large piece of land. Some say the price, by the way, was actually 100 lambs. Either way, coins or lambs, it could not have been a large field, or it was not a good piece of property. But Jacob now has his own land, just as Isaac had a burial cave. Now, this is near the city of Shechem, which is celebrated in Holy Scripture on account of this possession, and it's close to Shiloh, where the tabernacle would be. There he erected an altar and called upon the strong God of Israel. Jacob thought of staying there, and so he erected an altar. In other words, if I'm going to live here, I've got my house, I got my barns, I'm also going to build a church. He had not yet returned to his father Isaac. Hebron, though, is only 10 miles from Shechem, and Hebron is only 5 miles from Jerusalem. This makes it an easy one-day trip to go visit his father and brother, and that explains why he didn't move in with his brother or his father. He's about 15 miles away, give or take. An average person can go 20 miles easily in a day, go visit. So he really did follow his brother. He just said, I don't think it's going to work well for us to live next to each other. Moses uses some unique words in the Hebrew when it says that he built the altar. He called upon the God of, and either large G or small g, gods of Israel. Some believe Jacob was pointing to God being the God of gods. Okay? In other words, I'm recognizing that there's all of these gods out there, of which, by the way, my grandfather originally worshiped, and my father even did for a while, but now we know who the real God is, so all of this has changed. And he says, so now we've got this. And he says, so my God is bigger, because what is the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. It's a unique way of phrasing it. But others think that this is actually a reference to the Trinity, since Jacob had wrestled with the Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord. Thus, the first as the Son of God was to become incarnate, but as the second verb, as the Father and Holy Spirit. The three persons are one God of Israel. And so when he says, I've set up an altar to the God of gods, two ways to look at it. One, the God I worship is greater than all the other gods of all the other nations. Or Jacob begins to understand that I met a person in the Trinity. Because remember, in Genesis, first few words, the Spirit of God is hovering over the water. Now, none of this has been written yet, but the oral histories have been passed down. All of this has been there. And by the way, Book of Job may have already been written at this point. We're not sure. It's believed that it could be one of the, if not the first book, because of how it says. And so there's all this that has been passed down. Again, when we get to heaven, we can ask Jacob what he meant. But we're beginning to see that Jacob is now set. And so is the next section of God's history in the Old Testament. Go in peace, serve the Lord in gladness, and have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.